Bob Singleton. I met Bob years ago. He's the director of the Greater Astoria Historical Society. He knows an awful lot about tide mills in New York. I've tried for 14 years to get him up here, but he doesn't want to drive to Maine, so we figured out this way to get him here. He believes that tide mills made New York the center of financial things. I'll let him explain it.
I know that tide mills made New York what it is, and so I'm privileged to be invited to come and have a chat with you folks about how tide mills made New York City. So I want to thank you for inviting us. I also want to mention that this is not our first event with the Tide Institute. We hosted an event in New York City a few years ago, which was absolutely fantastic. It was an opportunity for all the various groups in New York that have an interest of tide mills within our community to meet up in one location. Bud ran the event, and that conversation has continued since then. And last year, we chat with each other on occasion. Last year, I said, you know what? I says, let's put together a program here in New York City and see if we can be associated with the Tide Mill Institute. So we let Bud and the group know what we were doing, and we're really pleased to be able to say that we are now the New York chapter of the Tide Mill Institute. So it's a real privilege. We get together now on a regular basis. We're just getting started. A lot of young people very interested in the tide mills, of what they represent, how they're very, very, relating to the environment, energy, and there may even be a future in terms of using tides. So, there's a lot of discussion going on. Right now, we're in discovery. We're taking a look at old maps. We're trying to figure out where the tide mills are or were. And I hope that next year, the group from Brooklyn can come up and give their presentation. They're doing some really fabulous group information. Also, whenever I give a lecture to students, and we were invited, we have everything from graduate students working as interns to being invited to elementary school kids, what have you. And I always work in the tide mill story. And I just want to share with you a few of the slides which we use with them. I show them, this is what a tide mill looks like. These are the various elements of a tide mill. And then I have this little thing here, and they all love movement. And I said, this is how the inside of the tide mill works. There's the wheel, and there's the two stones, and there's the meal coming out. And then I talked about how they used to sift bolting, sift the flour for various degrees, from fabulous baking to more of a crude type of flour. And to give you an idea as to what this process looks like, here's a penny and here's the screen, So it's really a lot of fun to see, their eyes wake up as they're like thinking like, oh, this is really something really cool. We're showing a new generation about the tide mills, how they worked, but even more important, the impact that they have on our great city, even to this day. So we'll get started here. Tide mills, where New York City started. There's another little GIF there showing a little tide stone. And again, our mill, we actually have both millstones from the Berger Urison Mill, which was one of the earliest mills in New York from the 1640s. And as I said, the second part of the program, we'll discuss that. Now, New York. Everybody knows what New York is, but New York didn't get where it is in one jump. It took a lot of effort for New York to sort of find itself. This was an area that had native tribes, had Europeans from all around the world, had people from Africa, everybody getting together, trying to make it work. And one of the most poignant stories, I think, of early New York was this letter, this note that was from one of the towns in New York, in Brooklyn, that wrote back to the Dutch in New Amsterdam saying, we came from a place where everything's settled and we're just regular people. And we come from all kinds of different places. and we don't know what the heck we're doing. Can you help us? And that's really poignant, and everything that you see in New York today was really put together through trial and error by the people that lived here. And the mills, the tide mills, played an important role in this process. So the British, who were very, very, very clever in becoming a world power, they were not the largest nation. They didn't have the biggest armies. They weren't even the wealthiest, but they were very, very clever. And they got their cleverness through their understanding and knowledge of the maritime trades. They used to have a fleet that was second to none. They didn't need to have a large army. All they needed to do was to take their troops on that fleet and drop them off at the right location at the right time and immediately win the battle. They also would equip, some nations had, very, very strong ships with big guns and stuff. What the British did, they had maps of the Maritimes. They would have these cartographers draw these pictures of a harbor so that they would know where they would sail their ships into a harbor to avoid the forts on the shore and where they could land their troops. This is really, really, really clever. Nobody else ever thought about this. All this groundbreaking. And then when they would have a colony like New York, they would pass what we call like the Navigation Acts, what they did for New York, where they said, okay, all the goods have to be imported to London. All the goods have to come from London. All the goods need to have an import duty. You need to have paperwork. And we're going to have everything official, everything regulated, everything to a specific code. Okay. Now, the colonies have things we don't have, like tobacco, sugar, London, wool, indigo, cotton. One thing missing here is wheat, because at this period of time in the 1600s, already was the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The farmers were leaving the rural areas and going into the cities to start the work in the very, very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So England needed food. And that's where, the colonies like New York and Virginia, that's where they really came to be very, very important and became a partnership with the home country. So the Navigation Acts were passed, but it didn't work, because New York being as far away as it was, there was also, the Dutch were sort of hovering in the distance, still wanted to trade with New Yorkers. And New York also had a big trade with the Caribbean. Well, the Caribbean was a place rife with a lot of mischief, a lot of crime, a lot of smuggling and what have you. And New York, being one of the major ports in the British Empire, was a place where this kind of spread. And since the London was so far away, communication was so poor, that people kind of like said, okay, we've got the laws. Now, I think it's really easy to circumvent these laws. Everybody knows that New York was the beaver and all that, that's where the Dutch came in, the beaver pelts. Well, that was great, but the beaver were sort of hunted into almost near extinction within a few decades. And since there was a lot of graft going on, when they would send the flour back to England, they would, put in some flour that really wasn't good, or some twigs and what have you. So, New York was kind of going off on its own tangent. It kind of started figuring out things, but not in the way that England really wanted to. There was also other problems, and I use this as the Scudder's Mill in English Kills, 1668. New York, since it was part of the trade with the Caribbean, was a semi-tropical climate. New England's very, very cold. The middle Atlantic states are the Appalachian Mountains, but you got a little pocket of warmth there. We're surrounded by a lot of water. We have the Gulf Stream. So New York City is actually warmer than the surrounding areas by about 10, 15, 20 degrees sometimes. And so what would happen is when these traders would come up from the Caribbean, they would, in the Caribbean, you'd have malaria and smallpox and yellow fever and all these things. Well, these guys would be on the ship. And when they would drop in New York, suddenly they would get sick. and they would like leave them here and go to London because England didn't want them to import sick people. And what would happen is that the mosquito would bite somebody, get that in the blood, and then they would then lay their eggs. There's a lot of marsh in New York City, a lot of low areas, swamps, what have you. And New York was a hotbed of all these diseases from the Caribbean, the smallpox, yellow fever, the malaria, everything like that. And so you'd have these mill ponds, these sort of bodies of water sitting there. And suddenly there'd be an outbreak in the middle of summer. And in Scudder's Mill, there was an outbreak where a fellow named John Hart, who lived nearby, died of, the record says, fever and ague, A-R-G-U. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but it's basically malaria. And the people really rose up in protest and made Scudder pull down his pond, and drain it. The cooler heads basically prevailed. He did put his pond in. The pond actually remained up until about the time of the Civil War, where there was no longer wheat and corn grown in New York. At that time, they started growing vegetables and fruit and flowers because New York City was nearby, and those are higher valued goods. And also, since it was such a warm climate, a lot of rain, good soil, they could grow these kinds of things, whereas wheat and corn kind of grew in a sort of a tougher kind of a climate. But the interesting story is that for Scudder had a granddaughter, and John Hart had a grandson, and the two of them married. And they're my ancestors. Scudder was my ancestor, and so was Hart. And it's kind of an interesting thing when I kind of go out to the general area where it is. There's absolutely nothing there but an industrial area. But I'm sort of proud, that, and I really didn't really know this until I started working into this history of the area, that I'm actually a descendant of one of the first millers in New York City. So that's pretty cool. And this is a map that I have of the area that we're around. We're in Long Island City. Now, if you've ever been to New York, you've got Manhattan, okay, you've got the East River, you've got Brooklyn to the south, and to the north, that's Queens. And the area of Queens that's furthest to the west is Long Island City. New York was comprised of New York, Brooklyn, Long Island City, and a bunch of villages and stuff. But this is a map of Long Island City. As late as 1900, people were still getting various kind of ailments from these malarial waters. So this thing that happened this year, the COVID virus, is something that happened routinely to New York throughout the 17th and 1800s. And of course, as I mentioned, smuggling and piracy. That was the city. Everybody, these guys would have these estates along the waterfront that put a little pier, okay, and then trade up in New England. They'd trade down in Florida. I got a call once from somebody who's doing an archaeological research on some boats that were near St. Augustine, and he said, "Oh, they were part of the Lawrence family from New Amsterdam." And I said, "No, there was a ban. They would never trade with the Spanish colonies." He said, "Well, the boats are there." So I did some more research, and yeah, they traded with everybody and anything. And you can imagine back in England, not only are they not getting the revenues that they expected from this colony, but now this colony is doing everything it can to do things behind England's back. So it was really a failed colony. The Dutch came back in, recaptured New Amsterdam for another year or so. And the English wanted to have a straight, they wanted to have New England, Virginia, the Carolinas, everything, just one band of English colonies. So they said to the Dutch, okay, we'll give you something if you drop New England. And the Dutch says, well, you have a couple of sugar plantations down in South America. That'll be a fair trade for us. And the English said, fine, take them. So that's how Suriname because it was part of British Guiana. And the Dutch thought that they got the better end of the deal. And the English probably thought they did too. But something had to be done. And the secret came by a gentleman, Governor Edmund Andros, was sent to England, and in 1670s they came up with something called the Bolting Act. Now, what he did is he took those wealthy merchants that were doing the smuggling and whatever. He said, "Look, guys, I know a way that you can make a ton of money legally." And he says, "Oh, okay, let's talk." And he said, "Look, why don't we, and England will give me the latitude to be able to make some changes in the deal. You can make your own boats. You don't have to have England's ships. Make your own ships here, okay? You can take your product, send it to England, pick up the goods in England, and bring it back. And you can make a lot of money, and you can do it perfectly legally. And the owner says, well, you know what? This makes sense. Now, just as a quick aside for you New Englanders, Andros ended up going up to New England. He's tried to put together a sort of a confederation of colonies from New Jersey all the way up through Maine. And you New Englanders arrested him. And he got sent back. But in New York, he worked his magic. And Parliament ratified the Bolting Act a few years later, and the New York merchants had a monopoly for milling grain, building ships to export flour and cornmeal to England. Historians credit this act as the foundation of New York City's fortune. Yes, tide mills. The Bolting Acts covered the largest export, wheat flour, cornmeal, set strict milling quality standards, transportation standards. Export quality was checked. So when you go to England, you had to have somebody, official government person to look at those barrels, open them up, and then put the stamp on them and say, yes, they are checked. They are the quality that has been ordered, and the paperwork matches it. Okay, and all ships in the area had to stop by New York City for this cargo inspection. Long Island farmers, East River tide mills, warehousemen, shipbuilders, coopers, merchants suddenly were inundated with more business than they could handle. Within a generation, the city's economy and housing grew threefold, shipbuilding fivefold, cattle tenfold. New York launched on a trajectory of growth that has enjoyed to this day. And it started because of the tide mills. As a tribute to this, the coat of arms of New York City has two flour barrels on it. And I've circled them here. They have the beaver, they have, but really it's the flour barrels that really launched New York City to its permanent level, what it is today. And that is our way of forever thanking the millers and making sure that every generation or whoever sets foot in New York and they see this seal, and it's all over the city, that they know who is responsible for making New York what it is to this day. And we have pictures, some crude drawings of the time. This is a late 17th century view. There's the tide mill. This was a windmill. That's actually where Broadway is. That's Lower Manhattan. And that's Maiden Lane, that little stream there. And there you can see them building ships along the East River waterfront there. Of course, Long Island was transformed. Suddenly, all those little hamlets that where you had those malarial tide mills and everything. Everybody says, we'll put up with the malaria if we can make tons of money. So suddenly, there was an explosion of tide mills all throughout Long Island. Now, I focus on Newtown Creek. That's sort of the border between Brooklyn and Queens. And of course, our friends are down at Gowanus Canal area. Nobody's really put together an entire record of where all the tide mills are in New York. And I have another lecture, which I'll set for another time, of the first research that we're starting to do to identify where these tide mills are in New York City. And there are many, many, many of them. All this is, of course, forgotten. But fortunately, we have maps, we have knowledge of being able to ferret this information out from the record. So that's something that's a lot of fun. And believe me, once this is brought to the light of day, it's something we're going to talk about a great deal here. And as I said, the tide mills, English kills and Dutch kills were sort of side creeks of Newtown Creek, which is the major creek. But these were running 24/7 because they had an inexhaustible source of tides. And the tides would come in, the tides would go out, and they'd simply reverse everything to take advantage of it with the mill ponds behind them. And I actually found a picture, late 17th century picture of a woman bolting flour. I haven't really sat down and figured out the details. I'm sure you folks know the details of something like this, but I just found this is a really interesting picture from that time period of somebody actually bolting flour. We'll talk about bolting flour a little bit later at the end of the program here. Now, New York being a place is always reinventing itself. As I had mentioned before, there was, the tide mills were important at a critical part of New York's history, but other things, New York evolves over time. And as it evolves, it moves on to other things. Now, just because it's moving on to something else doesn't mean that what went behind it was in the past. Everything is related. And this gentleman here, this is DeWitt Clinton. He's one of these fellows that was around at the beginning of the Republic that he ran to be president. He was defeated, but boy, he would have made a fabulous president. I mean, I could do a whole lecture on DeWitt Clinton. But he lived in a house on Newtown Creek, and it was sort of equal distance from Scudder's Mill, which was at the head of Newtown Creek on English Kills, and which we'll talk about later, Burger Jorison's tide mill, which was on Dutch Kills towards the East River. So he passed these tide mills every day. And he thought that that New York could benefit by expanding its trade, not only with the Hudson River Valley, but the United States had just acquired what they called the Inland Empire. That is the big purchase that we got from France of the Mississippi Valley in the early 1800s by Thomas Jefferson. And he said, if we can connect with that area, then New York City can go even to greater heights. And it's really interesting. New York State is called the Empire State. New York City is called the Empire City. And it's called that because of its connection with what they called at that time, the Inland Empire. And there's a picture right there. And all they had to do was put a small canal where Chicago is, and then do the Erie Canal, which connected the Mohawk River and the Hudson. And so suddenly this huge cornucopia of product flowed to New York. Now you would think they would go down to New Orleans, Now, a good case in point is they grew sugar in the lower Mississippi. That sugar should have been milled, and refined in New Orleans. But the New York traders, the New York merchants were there, went to the plantations, signed everything, and that sugar went all the way up the Mississippi to Chicago, across the Great Lakes, and then down to New York, where it was refined and sold. That system was in place up until the 1940s, when the United States, when they declared World War II, took a look at the railroad network and said, what are we doing? Have that stuff refined in Louisiana, for heaven's sakes, so we can free up the trackage for the war effort. Soon on, Chicago became a place where the corn and the wheat was refined, and its product, of course, went up tenfold. But again, it was still exported to New York because New York was the center of a huge metropolitan area, but also was the export hub for the country. So even though we didn't mill everything in New York, eventually milling the wheat ended in New York, the secondary impact of this whole process remained in New York. And New York took that and ran with it throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. There was what you call the Erie Canal barge fleet. I wrote a book on the East River, and we've done a lot of lectures on the East River. We became familiar with this stuff. There was a whole group of people that actually lived on these barges and traveled between Chicago and New York, carrying all this product. Most of it was flour. There was other products that they would carry, and also other types of things besides edible stuff. And they would lay over on the East River near South Street Seaport over the winter. And this is a picture of them overwintering. Also, New York, since New York was an export, New York had these elevators, these mills where they would grain elevators where they would store, and you can see here, so storing feed, oats, corn, meal. This was not grown in New York. This was grown outside of New York. And even you can see there's the Jack Frost refinery. That's in Long Island City. It's Newtown Creek, East River there. That refinery was around, I think, until like the 1950s or so. It's the largest US sugar refinery. Okay, so what happens here is that again, the business methods, the routes of this commerce was established because of the tide mills, and you can see now, even though the tide mills are no longer on the scene, how New York ran with this. And this is a really fabulous build. This building is still there. It's now LaGuardia Community College. Sunshine Biscuits. Luce Wiles were two executives who had a large milling company in Kansas City. And so they would then take all this stuff, mill it, take it to New York, again, and this was actually almost across the river from the Burger, Uris, and Tide Mills that I'm going to mention. It's actually within walking distance. You can actually see this from where the Tide Mill was. And this was the world's largest bakery from 1912, 1955. The trains would come in, unload the flour on the first floor, and send it to the top. And by the end of the day, you had baked goods being loaded into rail cars to be sent all around the country. So, you're taking a very simple concept from the 1700s or 1600s, and here in the 1900s, you can see how it just kept on building upon itself and coming into something that was just totally undreamed by the original drafters of the concept. And by the way, we actually have one of the barges. I think 2 or 3 barges are left. We still have one of the barges that used to bring the flour in from the Midwest, the Lehigh Valley barge. David Sharps and his family live in this, and they have a lot of programs going through here. They're in Brooklyn. If you're in New York, as a matter of fact, it'd be nice maybe having a conference in there. I'm sure he would he'd really appreciate something like this. This is actually on the Gowanus Canal where our friends from Brooklyn are working. I spent an afternoon with him. I autographed a book we did on the East River, and we chatted. And it was really nice to looking out those doors. And you see the Statue of Liberty, across from the harbor. Okay, the Millers were known as the sturdy group. They bequeathed us the legendary New York attitude. Show me the money by rubbing the thumb and forefingers. And that's how the Millers tested a batch of flour for quality. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate that. Bob has done an awful lot of work on that. And I believe he's got it written up. We'll try to get that for you available